Today, we're delving deeper into the historical account of Jenny Wiley's captivity. This episode, which continues the narrative of Mrs. Wiley's ordeal, follows episode 1, where she was captured by a group of Shawnee, Cherokee, and Wyandot individuals in eastern Kentucky in 1787. Our reference for this story is the book Eastern Kentucky Papers, The Founding of Harmon Station, written by William L. C. Connolly and published in 1910. This book offers a detailed account of the captivity of Jenny Wiley, along with the exploration and early settlements of the Big Sandy Valley, as well as parts of Virginia and Kentucky. Thank you for considering supporting the growth of this channel. Now, let's begin episode 2 of 3 on Jenny Wiley's captivity. In this episode, we'll learn about the fate of Mrs. Wiley's 15-month-old baby and encounter an unexpected event that wasn't covered in episode 1. After capturing Mrs. Wiley, the group headed towards the head of Walker's Creek, navigating mountain paths and shortcuts through valleys. They crossed Brushy Mountain to reach the headwaters of Wolf Creek. Late into the night, they halted in a large rock shelter between Wolf Creek and the Bluestone River, where they built a fire. Under an overhanging rock, a Cherokee among the group prepared venison from a pack he carried, and the group ate hastily before extinguishing the fire and erasing evidence of their camp. By dawn, they reached the upper branches of the Bluestone River, which were swollen from recent rains. They crossed the rugged terrain, including a large flat-topped mountain and a ridge in the watershed between the Wyandot and Tug Rivers. The group finally camped late in the afternoon in a rock shelter near a creek. Feeling safer from pursuit, they rested without hunting for fresh game, relying on dried venison and parched corn for sustenance. Mrs. Wiley, exhausted from a grueling 24-hour march over mountains, streams, and through dense thickets, struggled to keep up. Her child, distressed and hoarse from crying, was a constant source of sorrow. At this camp, she witnessed the warriors fashioning hoops from green branches and stretching the scalps of her brother and children over them, a sight that deepened her despair. That second night, Mrs. Wiley was bound with strips of raw deerskin. Unable to sleep due to physical and emotional anguish, she experienced vivid recollections of her children's deaths and cried out in her delirium. Her cries disturbed an elderly Shawnee, who unbound her and prepared a soothing herbal infusion to calm her nerves. The Shawnee chief gave Mrs. Wiley a herbal preparation to drink, which allowed her to fall into a troubled sleep throughout the night. Before dawn, he woke her as the group prepared to leave. Mrs. Wiley was given some corn and venison for breakfast, and the group resumed their journey. The mountain streams were swollen from the recent heavy rains, and the Indians avoided them by sticking to ridge paths. Mrs. Wiley, weak and exhausted, struggled to keep up. The Indians urged her to quicken her pace, but her progress remained slow and painful. The only thing that motivated her was the fear that if she couldn't keep up, they might harm her child. The Cherokee chief had suggested several times that they could kill her baby, and though some of the warriors agreed, the old Shawnee chief did not. As the day wore on, Mrs. Wiley's constitution gave her some strength, and she was able to cover more ground, though her pace still wasn't fast enough to satisfy the group. The Indians sent 2 members back to watch for any potential pursuit, expecting the hunters to follow their trail. Some of the younger warriors believed the rains had erased their tracks, but the Cherokee disagreed, especially if they were being followed by Matthias Harmon. The Cherokee chief's arguments for killing the child were based on this belief. The old Shawnee chief resisted these suggestions, but could not hold out for long. By the end of the day's march, the group set up camp at a location similar to the previous nights, stopping earlier than usual because one of the warriors had killed a fat bear. The group feasted well into the night. Despite the arduous march, they had covered less ground than on the previous day, but Mrs. Wiley's condition had improved somewhat. However, her feet were badly bruised and blistered. She feared that her child would not survive the night. With no better option, she rubbed the baby's body with bear's grease and, following the Shawnee chief's advice, made the child swallow some of the melted fat. This seemed to help, as the child's condition improved by the morning. The Shawnee chief also prepared a decoction of leaves and the inner bark of the white oak, which he instructed Mrs. Wiley to apply to her feet, The soothing effects of this remedy brought her immediate relief. The following morning, Mrs. Wiley applied another dose of the decoction, which further improved her condition. The child also showed signs of improvement, giving her renewed hope. The party left camp before daylight, continuing their journey toward the Ohio River. A heavy rain had fallen the previous night, and the rain continued throughout the day. As night approached, a fierce storm of wind and rain forced the group to take shelter under a cliff, where they built a fire and camped. This camp was located in the hills west of the headwaters of 12-Pole Creek. The Indian scouts who had been sent back each day reported that no pursuers had been seen. The next morning, as was their custom, the Indians broke camp before dawn. However, the continuous march and lack of food were taking a toll on Mrs. Wiley. She struggled to keep up, her pace slower than the day before, weakened by exhaustion and the constant burden of carrying her child. The Shawnee chief warned her of the consequences of falling behind, but despite her best efforts, she could not satisfy her captors. Later that day, the scouts returned with news. They had seen a large group of white men on horseback following their trail. The Indians discussed their options, and while some proposed ambushing the white men, the Cherokee chief suggested a more drastic measure. He proposed killing the child to avoid being followed and a change of course. Mrs. Wiley, desperate, promised to keep up with the march, hoping that with the Shawnee chief's help, she could delay the death of her child. The Indians then turned west, descending the hills toward the Tug River. They sought a small stream and waded through it, changing to another when the first became too deep. Mrs. Wiley was able to keep up for a few miles, but soon began to fall behind. Despite her strenuous efforts, she couldn't match the pace of the Indians. She feared for her child's safety, suspecting that her friends might be nearby, though the Indians had not shared any information with her. Eventually, the Cherokee chief stopped. He had been leading the march, and most of the group was far ahead. Mrs. Wiley knew what this meant. When he returned to her, it would be the end of her child's life, and possibly her own. The Shawnee chief was following behind her in the water. In a final, desperate attempt to protect her child, Mrs. Wiley ran out of the stream and back upstream, carrying her child. She had no real plan, only the instinct to remove her child from immediate danger, though she knew it was a futile effort. The Shawnee chief, surprised by her actions, quickly chased her down and caught her just as the Cherokee chief arrived. The child was seized by the feet, and the Cherokee chief dashed its brains against a beech tree before scalping it. Mrs. Wiley was pushed back into the stream and forced to continue her flight. It was nearly dark when the group reached the Tug River, which was swollen from the rain. As they approached its banks, a violent thunderstorm broke over the valley. The Indians knew that crossing the river was their only hope of escape from the pursuing party. The river, already treacherous, had become a raging torrent, filled with debris and swift currents. Mrs. Wiley was terrified when told she must cross the river by swimming with the Indians. The river's fierce twists and turns were visible only through the flashes of lightning illuminating the sky. The prospect of surviving such a crossing seemed impossible. However, two Shawnee warriors seized her, dragging her screaming into the water. They swam on either side of her, holding her firmly by the arms and using the current to carry them downstream. With remarkable skill, they avoided the debris, their bodies mostly above the water, working their way toward the opposite shore. After what seemed like miles to Mrs. Wiley, the group was finally carried to the west bank of the river, where they reached calm water at the mouth of a small creek.